Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines, take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 25th of March, 2026. Let's get started. So, we are seeing drones all over the place in Iran. These cheap Shahed drones that can fly all over the place and blow stuff up at will. And they are a royal pain in the butt to shoot down at scale. Counter-drone technology has been top of mind for the U.S. military ever since we started seeing the employment of cheap tactical drones in the Russian-Ukraine war. And the evolution of drones in warfare has just continued to ramp up, and we're seeing the latest iteration right now in Iran. So what are we doing about it? What are we doing to counter this drone threat? Well, there is a new task force the government has stood up. I know, a government task force. I'm skeptical as well, but hey, let's see what happens. It's called Joint Interagency Task Force 401, and they are charged with fast-tracking the development and adoption of counter-drone technology into the Department of War. So today we're sitting down and talking to Paul Lushenko, who is their chief strategist, to get his insight on what the future of counter-drone technology looks like and what we can do to support the force.
Hey, this is Brent Skinner, host of Small Talk Window here at the Work Defined Podcasting Network. Have you ever wanted a short podcast to listen to during a coffee break of your workday? You've come to the right place. My guests dispense with the small talk as quickly as possible and settle into a meaningful conversation around the world of work.
Well, good morning and welcome to the podcast. How you doing today?
Doing well. How you doing?
Doing great. So could you please introduce yourself in your own words to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, and we were joking beforehand about the disclaimer that's obligatory for those of us in uniform who are speaking in our official capacity. So these are my own thoughts today. Happy to share them based upon especially the trajectory of my research for so-called drone warfare and the incorporation of AI into drones, and they do not in any way reflect the opinions, the positions of the Department of War, certainly not the federal government, nor the Department of the Army, given the uniform I'm wearing today. So my name is Paul Lushenko. I go by Polly. I've been called that since I was probably 6 months old from my mom, and it stuck. And I currently serve as the chief strategist for the U.S. military's outfit, which was designed this last year to synchronize sort of a whole of government approach to counter drones, not just in the homeland, that's a serious concern, but also to protect our forces abroad, a la what you're seeing in Iran right now. And that outfit is called JITA 401, the Joint Interagency Task Force 401.
Gotcha. Yeah. For those who are just listening, Paulie is here in his very fine Patagucci sporting his Ranger Regiment tab. So I know there's too many Ranger Regiment guys coming to the show. I need to find some more group people. That's a me problem. I will work on that. I promise. Now,
yeah, it's like mixing oil and water, but I'm happy to be here with you.
In fairness, I actually wanted to go to Ranger Regiment first, and then I had a battalion commander that said Ranger Regiment is a sham job for officers because the soldiers are so good they don't need you, so you're staying here. And no one from my battalion was allowed to put in a packet for Ranger Regiment, but they can't keep you from putting in one for Special Forces. So I walked out of that meeting and down to the SF recruiter and started putting that packet together instead, and life played out from there.
Oh, that's excellent. There may be a kernel of truth in your first statement, yeah.
So when we're thinking about drone warfare, obviously we're seeing all this stuff going on in the Straits of Hormuz with Iran. We've seen lots of crazy stuff go on in Ukraine for those who are following even back to the Azerbaijan conflict in 2020. Do you think that when historians look back on this in 50 years, they're going to view drones and how they're being employed as a revolution in warfare, or is this just part of the natural evolution in technology that we see as different things get adopted over time?
Yeah. Well, certainly it's a really important question. It's one of the leading questions that experts will debate, which is to say revolution versus evolution, also other things like character versus nature of war, tactical effectiveness versus strategic effectiveness. Before I get into this question, and it may be worthwhile for your audience to be aware of my background, right? So I spent the better part of 20 years, as you stated, supporting U.S. special operations in all the garden spots that you're well familiar with, Iraq, Afghanistan, parts of Central and South Asia. And in doing so was, like yourself, on the initial sort of bow wave of the adoption of these unmanned aerial systems. And because of that experience, what I wanted to do in my research and graduate degrees was really explore sort of bridging the theory and practice of drones, not just in the way of tactical and strategic effectiveness, but also in terms of questions like perceptions of legitimacy or public attitudes of support for these capabilities. The other thing that we often confront when we talk about so-called drone warfare is what are we actually talking about? Right. There's several different pathologies that people kind of get pinioned against. Some people will conflate drone warfare with the platform itself. So think like, the MQ-1 Reaper and the Predator MQ-9 that follow that. And there are other capabilities, the Global Hawk, the Raven, so on and so forth. Others will just kind of reduce the practice of drone warfare to the platform for targeted killing. Right. So trying to find, fix, and finish a high value target, or just kind of one modality of warfare, counterterrorism, if not a broader sort of evolution of warfare towards remote warfare. And so in the background of your question about evolution and revolution are these debates which people are circling back to right now after having contended with them, 10, 15 years ago. And so when we talk about revolution and evolution and what drones mean for these concepts, we first have to define what these concepts are, right? And so when I take a look at revolution in military affairs, so-called RMAs, by the way, there are those who say that the last RMA was the first Persian Gulf War with sort of net-centric warfare, integration of sensors. It's one school of thought, at least. And Andrew Karpevich, University of Chicago, is sort of the leading theorist surrounding RMAs. They'll really not take a look at just the hardware that's emerged, right? But also the implications of hardware across what we call .mil PFP, right? So that's a big military term or acronym that talks about sort of the doctrinal implications of emerging capability, the material itself and what it can provide at scale. So tactically, operationally, strategically, and a whole host of other considerations to include training, policy, the implications for leadership. And so when we take a look at drones from that lens, I don't think what we're seeing right now is a revolution in military affairs, at least in the U.S. military context, so much as a evolution of the application of violence due in part to this new tool. And so really what we're talking about there is the shifting character of warfare, which explains the moderating effect of technologies, AI, artificial intelligence, cyber, and drones on the way that soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine will apply force. And just to punctuate this, what we're not seeing in the U.S., like we're seeing in Ukraine, is a wholesale adoption of new drone and counter drone companies, battalions, brigades, divisions, so on and so forth. What we are seeing is an adoption of existing military occupational specialties, let's say aviators and so on and so forth, that would gain sort of lessons from Ukraine to align planning to contend with drones on the battlefield and deploy these systems as well. And so mark me on the wall for someone who thinks that these capabilities are more evolutionary than revolutionary. I will say as a caveat that where I think we could potentially talk about sort of revolution in military affairs is with the integration of AI into drones such that they produce lethal autonomous weapon systems, right? And this opens up a whole host of questions about the extent to which AI has shifted warfighting on the modern battlefield based upon what happened in Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine, and what's happening indeed in the war against Iran.
Do you think that the wide-scale adoption of drones in various capacities by various militaries, even though itself is not a revolution in military affairs, do you think that's setting up AI to become a revolution in military affairs?
I think it potentially could, right? And so what is AI? I talk a lot about AI with different military and sort of civilian or public audiences. And the first question I ask is, how do we define artificial intelligence, right? There's a tendency, much like with drones, to conflate it to the algorithm. But AI really is a function of compute power. This is why you see the emergence of large-scale data centers around the world, to include especially in the global south. It's about the algorithm, and it's especially about the data. And so the extent that AI has had implications right now, it's really across what we would know, Scott, as sort of low density MLSs, or really important warfighting functions like intelligence, sustainment, and so forth. And so I think where that changes, meaning that we draw upon AI to hasten the targeting cycle. Of course, we're aware of what Israel did in Gaza with Lavender, Where's Daddy? and these other sort of decision support systems. I think where this becomes different and interesting is the incorporation of AI into drones such that we can proliferate drones at scale. So small, commercially available drones that are easily weaponized, all the way up to large arm and network drones, which is really the central thrust of my research empirically, the Reaper and the Predator, and then deploy these to do our bidding on our behalf. And really from a campaign perspective and planning perspective, is use them simultaneously in different theaters potentially to create multiple dilemmas that would create windows of opportunity to, I don't know, overcome anti-access aerial denial, right? So this is really important for the joint warfighting concept. That's much harder to contend with. And then the countermeasure becomes certainly a more serious adoption of AI decision support systems to reduce especially the cognitive burden on the joint force to contend with that from our adversaries.
Gotcha. That seems like a very typical thing for the American military to come up with. Let's scale this like crazy, throw tons of resources out and develop these very high-end technologies. I think it's interesting that you first started talking about drones. You went through, the MQ-9, the Reaper, these larger platforms. Most folks, when they think about drones these days, the first interaction that they have with it or awareness of it is the war in Ukraine, where we've seen this proliferation of extremely small unmanned systems. What lessons do you think we should be drawing from that war? And how do we get from what we've seen going on in Ukraine to the capability set that you just described? Because it seems like we've been watching a very low end use of drones at mass scale. And if I understood what you said, yours was a very high end use combined with AI that really only a country like the United States would probably have the resources to pull off.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty complex question, right? We could probably spend the entire time talking about it. I mean, the lessons from Ukraine, which I think are actually consistent with broader sort of trajectory of warfighting, not just based upon Ukraine, but based upon Israel's sort of approach to Gaza, and you mentioned Azerbaijan. And so I think a couple things. One is clearly the cost imposition of these smaller commercially available drones on larger powers, the asymmetry that these would provide to especially non-state actors. And there are myriad examples, right? So one that comes to mind is the use of commercially available, easily weaponized drones by the Houthis, right, in Yemen, shooting those at fraction of the cost against U.S. warships in the Red Sea, when we would be contending with them with $1 million, if not more, missiles. So the asymmetry, cost imposition, exploiting vulnerabilities is certainly a lesson to be drawn from Ukraine. And it's important, right, because in this context, you have a less capacious country like Ukraine that has proliferated drones through its army of drones to contend with a more capacious country like Russia with a large standing army. And indeed, scholars have talked about this level the playing field in creating somewhat of a stalemate right now. So I think the asymmetry of these capabilities, especially for non-state actors, is a really important lesson that we ought to draw from Ukraine that I think is on stark display right now during Operation Epic Fury, with Iran vis-a-vis Israel and in the United States. And that's no secret. I mean, our soldiers who have been killed in the region have been killed by these one-way attack Shahed 136 drones launched by Iran. The other lesson, which I think is consistent with the first and an extension of it, is the contagion effect of these capabilities, right? And so when you take a look at the sort of broad trajectory of drone warfare research for the last 20 years, certainly since 9/11. I mean, drones aren't a new thing, right? This is a reimagination of a capability that's been around for 100 plus years. But when you take a look at the evolution of drone warfare scholarship, it typically first and foremost focused on sort of the effectiveness of these capabilities. I mean, how strategically effective are they in war termination, not just killing your adversary? Scholars have also spent a lot of time talking about sort of the moral, ethical, and legal implications of these capabilities. Much less attention has been paid to the implications of drones for non-state actors. But we know that trans-regional terrorist or violent extremist organizations are mostly what the United States will continue to confront on a day-to-day basis, aside from the consistent concern for a great power conflict, let's say with China in the Indo-Asian Pacific. And so another lesson to be learned here is just the ease of adoption or uptake of these smaller drones by non-state actors across the world. I mean, it takes a lot of technical wherewithal and financial resources to actually adopt a large armed and networked or drone, right? It also, and this is something that surprises most people, takes actually a lot of people to operate a large armed and networked drone. I mean, 200 plus from the ground control station all the way to the operator, the sensor operator, the intelligence analyst that would support the operations as well. And so the ease of uptake is something that's really serious as well. And then the other thing, which is central to what I do on a day-to-day basis, is a third lesson, would be the implications for drones on homeland defense, national security. And I think you see this clearly reflected in the recent national security strategy. And then importantly, the national defense strategy, which has pivoted the U.S. military's focus, the joint force focus, to protecting the Western Hemisphere, something akin to what people have called, the Trump doctrine. It was a reimagination, a renewing of the Monroe Doctrine. And so a lot of what we're doing in the U.S. military right now is attempting to right-size our approach for homeland defense, right? There are other examples, but I think these three lessons are really key to understand sort of the trajectory of drone warfare and why this isn't just a capability which is reserved for distant battlefields. I mean, it's on our shores. It's on the southern border, right? It's at stadiums coming to, an event near you any day.
Yeah, two interesting observations that have come out of the Iran war. Well, one is just how cheap and easy it is for different folks to operate these systems. But two is the targeting of civilian infrastructure as a form of escalation. We've seen Iran go after oil fields, we've seen them go after desalination plants. They've ramped that up and backed it off at different times, and who knows, by the time this comes out, we'll be on the escalation ladder with that. But when you take these cheap drones' ability to target civic infrastructure, combined with the ability of small violent extremist organizations to operate some of these cheaper systems, it does seem like there needs to be a reimagining of how we perceive American defense at home, because it almost seems like it's inevitable that somebody's going to get their hands on one of these smaller systems and fly them into some part of the power grid and take something out at some point. Do you think this is something that we're taking the right steps towards addressing?
Absolutely. And before I get that, because this is another complicated question. So drones on their own are actually a really interesting puzzle. And there's some great research that has come up recently from my colleague at MIT, Eric Lynn Greenberg, who was a reserve Air Force lieutenant colonel, but also serves as an associate professor at MIT. He's got this interesting book that was just published called Drone Revolution. And what he contends with here is a wicked empirical puzzle that, on the one hand, drones used on their own will create the tendency for a moral hazard. Just because I have the capability, I can use it. And indeed, one of the strategic benefits of drones from a political perspective is that I can use them in demonstration or a signal of resolve. I'm doing something to get after a threat, right? But in doing so, I sort of circumvent democratic accountability and oversight for these strikes. And by the way, you just point to president after president. Obama was known famously as the drone president to sort of evidence this. But on the other hand, right, what happens with the use of drone is actually a de-escalation of conflict. Right. And so the example par excellence here would be the Iranian shoot down of an MQ-9 Reaper years ago under the first Trump presidency that resulted in no action from President Trump. In fact, I think the famous quote or anecdote was, "It's just a drone. It's uninhabited. We can weather the storm." And so when we take a look at drones in and of themselves, they actually provide interesting benefits politically and then strategically to sort of dampen down the toasons of war. I think what you're seeing right now is something a little bit different, which is the integration of drones, small, medium, and large, right, by way of Iran, that are used in concert with conventional ballistic and cruise missiles and other capabilities. And this would be in pace or in stride of a war. As limited as we may want it to be, it certainly is a war. In that respect, the targeting of civilian infrastructure the targeting of military capabilities is not so surprising. This becomes essentially another tool in the kit bag for the Iranian military to use, and on the other hand, for the U.S. military to use as well, as reports demonstrate that we used a similar capability called the Lucas, first of its kind for the U.S. military, and a one-way attack capability as well. So the broader campaign conversation here from an air power perspective is sort of effects-based targeting, that we would identify a center of gravity against an adversary, identify critical requirements and vulnerabilities, and then attempt to target those to disintegrate, to destroy, to dislocate, whatever it may be, to achieve our strategic objectives. And Iran's doing the same thing. Now, the wrinkle here becomes the efficacy of actually targeting deliberately civilians and civilian infrastructure, right? And now there's a longstanding literature. I'd point you back to Robert Pape and his famous book called Bombing to Win that shows that over time this actually isn't an effective tool because it delegitimizes an effort, a military effort, creates grievances that over time are hard to sort of contend with. And so that's a whole nother discussion, but also related. What I see from Iran right now is sort of a classical play from its playbook, which is to say trying to regionalize the conflict and targeting these sites to bring regional countries to apply pressure against the United States. But as we've seen, and I don't know, statement after statement from the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, the CJCS, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, this has actually backfired. And I would anticipate that it continues to do so, especially with the Strait of Hormuz, the blocking of that when people start to feel the pinch in their pocketbook with escalating sort of oil prices.
So you brought up center of gravity there. And so here's a really nerdy question for you. For my doctor and geek hack bat on. So American military, we always focus on and planning a center of gravity, someplace to leverage all your resources against that'll have an outsized effect on whatever problem you're trying to solve. Lots of descriptions of it, but I think that's a generally accurate one. It almost seems that a country like Iran can look at that approach to warfighting and simply remove any centers of gravity that could be targeted. Their deliberate construction of horizontal institutions that can survive decapitation efforts and the proliferation of these small drones and an adoption of a protracted strategy appears to be directly designed to counter the type of campaign plans we develop when we focus on a center of gravity. Do you think center of gravity analysis is still an appropriate way for America to plan and fight wars? Because it didn't work in the global war on terror very well. And it seems like we need another operational framework to try to understand how to counter threats from countries like Iran, and the need for it's only going to grow with the proliferation of these small drone systems that are going to spread through the same contagion effect that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the natural question becomes, what is that other framework? So a couple of thoughts.
Yeah.
First is I do think as a strategist that center of gravity analysis is applicable at certain sort of phases on the continuum of competition here and sort of modalities of warfare, right? And in fact, that would be on a country-to-country basis, a 1v1, nation-state on nation-state. I think that makes sense based upon sort of the whole of government approach that each side has to wage in this context. I do agree that there's been a distortion of that based upon counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, where the center of gravity is based in large measure, if not only, on political will, right? What's the of our adversary? So what's the famous quote, right? I mean, you may have the watch, we have the time, or something to that effect. I mean, this is exactly what happened in Afghanistan, and you were there just the same as me to see this firsthand. And so stepping back, I think really the framework that becomes most applicable here, which brings it back to where I work on a daily basis, is sort of whole of government approach, that we would capitalize, leverage, synchronize all elements of national power, not just the military instrument, but also diplomacy, information through social media, so on and so forth, and then economics. And I think that you're seeing that emerge in the current conflict. So certainly the military objectives, they appear clear enough, right? So we're going to deny the ability to nuclearize. We're going to destroy the ballistic missile capability. We're going to destroy the Navy, right? And do so in such a way that it's very, very difficult to reconstitute and continue to beleaguer the region. In terms of the economic component here, I think you see a lot of outreach, especially from the Department of State, the Department of Energy, to weather the storm due to a closing of the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, two sides of the same coin here. One of the instruments, which is very important, would of course be the military instrument of power through the U.S. Navy and Air Force and the combined effects that they can provide. On the informational sort of perspective from a whole of government approach, I think naming and shaming can be important in terms of international norms or standards of conduct. I mean, we don't expect states who are rightful members of international society to operate in ways that Iran has at this point. And then diplomatically would be the outreach that I think the department has done very well across regional allies and partners. And so I think really these two things aren't mutually exclusive. You probably have to combine them, that on a political level, we would look to our senior leaders to do sort of the economics, the information, the diplomacy. The military instrument of power becomes fairly clean and clear with the U.S. military. And so from a strategic level, I think it's integration of this and adopting some framework. And by the way, I mean, all frameworks have, because they're parsimonious, trade-offs and challenges and weaknesses. The trick, at least in my humble assessment, having done this for several decades now, is to have a framework, right? And so I think it's good to have a framework and attempt to moderate or adapt that to the current operation environment.
Gotcha. So it mentioned briefly that, drone techniques have spread through contagion from conflict to conflict, and they evolve very rapidly. And I was reading somewhere that, the adaptation cycle for drone warfare and drone techniques in Ukraine, something like 35 to 45 days between new drone techniques developed, countermeasures developed and employed, and then new techniques developed again. Do you think that the same contagion effect that we see proliferate techniques in drone warfare has had the same impact on counter drone techniques? Because we seem to be using the same technology that we had 20 years ago to counter current drone threats in Iran. And it's curious that despite this rapid evolution and proliferation of drone technology, the counters to it seem to have lagged in development.
Yeah. So a couple questions in there in terms of what we can draw from Ukraine and what we're doing for the U.S. military here. So, I kind of marvel with the amount of drone warfare experts, so-called experts there are right now, are taking a look at Ukraine and saying we got to learn everything lock, stock, and barrel from Ukraine, the lessons there. I mean, that's certainly true as far as it goes, that this is a war that has put on a pedestal drones, again, to level the playing field. But it's not a perfect analogy, right? This is an existential threat for the Ukrainians. By necessity, they have engaged in a capability that provides asymmetry against a larger sort of foe. We haven't, certainly, as I talked about before, adopted all the measures from them, but still there's something to be learned there. So what does that look like in terms of what do I do on a day-to-day basis? And so when we talk about sort of the shifting character of war, we talk about new tools that we can adapt. They already exist. We can adapt. And then we talk about innovation or building novel technologies. And I think we're seeing that right now from the U.S. military. Certainly there's a recognition that we have a laborious sort of procurement cycle. But the measures that the Secretary of War Hegseth have taken are designed to overcome that. And so in the last year or so, we've had a litany of executive orders that have designed the department to move very quickly on getting new tools, drones especially, but also counter-drone capability. And then also sort of short circuit the laborious procurement timeline. In JIDA 401, we certainly have a sense of urgency. We were designed in August of this last year to synchronize a whole of government approach, right? So there's that word again, to overcome this threat, working with federal agencies and departments within the homeland, allies and partners abroad, and then even down to the state, local, tribal, and territorial level. And so our lines of effort consist of sort of joint force training for homeland defense, increased lethality, things of that nature. And we have one measure of effectiveness, which is about the adoption of new capability. We are moving as quickly as we possibly can to outfit the joint force to contend with these capabilities. One small example would be tech transfer from Ukraine. So you've likely read recently that about 10,000 MUROPS capabilities, which is essentially another drone that's designed to defeat an adversary drone, were shifted very, very quickly to Ukraine to buttress our defenses. There are a whole host of other considerations to include what we're doing at the southern border, right? So this is not lost on anybody. And we have like a startup mentality to sort of adopt a VC or venture capitalist term to try to move pretty quickly to outfit our forces with capability. By the way, just because you're using a pre-existing capability that would be designed for sort of a group 3 drone, we call it, so a Shahed or higher, a veritable missile, and not something like a small drone, is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, again, I marvel at sort of the ingenuity of our soldiers across the Army, at least, but also the Joint Force, to be able to adapt these capabilities. So we're doing an awful lot in this space to try to align funding, try to align procurement to meet urgent operational needs, both at home and abroad.
How is that procurement process getting improved? Because, one of the basic things that folks are reading about in the news is that we're using $1 million missiles to shoot down, $50,000 drones, and our industrial base just physically can't produce enough to keep up with demand, whether it's our demand, Israel's demand. Um, South Korea's losing resources, and they actually have a nuclear armed rival right next door that can reach the United States. So we're sinking a lot into this conflict, and it's not certain, even if it stopped today, how long it would take us to replenish our current supply of counter drone equipment. So what has been happening to reduce the cost of counter drone technology and speed up the adoption through the procurement process?
Yeah. So a couple things in the framework I want to use here, just making some notes, is sort of strategically, operationally, and tactically. So all the way from the battlefield up to what we do to synchronize plans on behalf strategically of aims and objectives, right? So strategically, these executive orders coming from the Department of War and indeed the White House, right, for drone dominance are really important to send a demand signal to industry partners to calibrate their R&D or research and experimental sort of efforts for drones, but especially for counter drones. That's significant. And what that comes with is a lot of money, right, that we would contract to get capabilities fairly quickly. Operationally, and this is where JIDA 401 is really important, is our governance, right? And so there are other outfits in the past that were designed to do this sort of thing, in part that JIDA 401 is doing, but they really lack sort of the structural alignment. They lack the authorities, and they lacked access to senior leaders to make decisions on critical technology, certainly for large pockets of money. And so our governance process is really important to synchronize all services pursuant to a common end, which in this case is force protection and homeland defense. When we talk about where the rubber meets the road, how do units across the Joint Force get access to these capabilities? We just built what we call a marketplace, right? So this is in a virtual space that would have available across sensing, affecting, use whatever framework you want, detection, track, identify, whatever, these capabilities been in such a way that have been certified that people can purchase very rapidly, should they have access and a need to have access to the website, right? And so I think what you're seeing right now, as opposed to what we had even a year or two ago, is an alignment of the strategy, right, with sort of our operational governance approach to make this move very, very quickly, and then actually putting in practice or operationalizing the intent of senior leaders through things like the marketplace. Now, it goes beyond that, of course, with tech transfers, with our outreach for standard data standardization, rather, with our key allies and partners. Secretary of Army Dan Driscoll just sort of launched an initiative to do that with allies and partners. So we have uniform data to work through some of our systems, right? And so the approach is actually pretty sensible. Of course, there's a bureaucracy to make sure that we're using taxpayer dollars judiciously, right? But I see here, unlike in my previous jobs within the Pentagon, a concerted effort to move very, very, very quickly in this space. And for good reason. I mean, we have people who are dying and who are actively held at risk because of these capabilities abroad.
So it sounds like this is almost an evolution or a replacement of what Defense Innovation Unit was supposed to be. I think they're on like their third evolution as an organization. So how is JIDA's 401's approach to developing counter drone technology either piggyback on or evolve out of or replace what DIU was supposed to be doing more broadly as a mission.
Yeah, certainly DIU has been a change agent, right? And there's a great book that I commend people to called Unit X that talks about Ash Carter when he was Secretary of Defense and the emergence of this capability. Again, that took senior leaders there you go, motivation.
Yeah.
So the reality is, and I'd point your listeners to the action memos that established, they're all publicly available, that established JETA 401, is that we have assumed some of their responsibilities, certainly in terms of governance of the money that they had at disposal. And so this takes us back to the previous administration and what was called the Replicator Initiative. So Replicator 1 was designed to proliferate very rapidly small, attritable drones that would create mass against adversaries. And then Replicator 2 matched that with defensive capabilities. We have since rebranded that because it's a bit broader. It's now called Domestic Shield. But we don't own that money, but we do, but we have a governance of that money to buy capability, buy it smartly where it makes sense, and to proliferate it rapidly. The other thing, too, is that DIU and JETA 401 are not either or. I mean, we are complementary outfits. A great example of this would be some of the experimentation that DIU is leading, Drone Gauntlet being one of those that you may have read about recently in open space to identify effective capability. And so I think really the hashtag here is this governance pursuant to a clear strategy. Right, that we would be able to JETA 401 synchronize all of these disparate efforts across the department.
Are there any concrete examples of capabilities that JETA 401 has brought into the force since it's been formed? Has anything actually gotten into the hands of a warfighter?
Absolutely, right. And so some of these may not have been produced de novo or new technology that we've built ourselves. And again, we're not about turning wrenches, turning screws, right? We're about identifying best of breed capabilities, state of the art, as far as we can tell, innovative to get to the hands of warfighters. So I'd point you to a series of capabilities that we pushed down to the southern border to include high energy lasers and other capabilities, but also the tech transfer stuff that we've worked very hard. In fact, my boss, General Ross, who runs our outfit, Matthew Ross, was in Ukraine prior to the start of Operation Epic Fury, identifying capability that had implications for our warfighters' lethality and protection abroad. And so we've done a whole host of things to try to push capability very, very quickly. But here's the other thing about capability, right? Often when people talk about counter-drone operations, much like with drone warfare, they kind of reduce it or conflate it to hardware. Like we want the best drone to defeat another drone. Capabilities as we envision them within JETA 401 are much more comprehensive. It's not just a hardware issue. It's about the policies and authorities that would enable people to operate with confidence, especially in the homeland, right? It's about the data and the standardization of data and access to data to build broad situational awareness and to change decisions into yes/no answers for commanders at time of need. It's about sustainment, right, over time. And so those are the things that are potentially much less sexy, but are actually really, really integral to the concept of countering drones, much like integration. So another thing that JETA 401 has done, which is quite revolutionary, and comes with a hefty price tag, as you'll see, is adopt a common-wide C2 license through Anduril's Lattice to build sort of interoperable systems that are plug and play, that we could take a best of breed, sort of a sensor, a radar, or an effector, another drone, and integrate it very rapidly into this suite of command and control. That is not insignificant for a variety of reasons. And I think that the announcement was just made for about a $20 billion multi-year contract to do that across the joint force. That is actually the secret sauce of counter-drone operations. About 4 months ago, I led an effort for the Secretary of War called Operation Clear Horizon. I mean, it was a team effort, but I happened to be the last lieutenant colonel standing. And so I got tagged with leading this effort. And that was designed to conduct a very realistic, rigorous joint homeland defense exercise of all of our counter-drone systems across the services, to include programs of record, but also newly fielded emerging capability. And we pulled a variety of lessons from this exercise. The principal lessons were, one, we had to have common C2. So we've done that. That was not insignificant for a variety of reasons. And two was to have a low collateral defeat effector or capability in the homeland, which is to say it's not non-lethal, it can be lethal, but we're trying to attenuate risk to civilians and their property. So things like that we've done that don't get much fanfare because it's not like the sterling image of a drone on TV, but is actually a lot more important to counter drone operations than potentially the capability in and of itself. And then, of course, the training that goes with that.
Yeah. You brought up a really interesting point earlier, and I think this is something that folks don't understand about how the government works with the defense industrial base. Um, for the defense industrial base to respond to a warfighter in need, they need to know that the money's there. They need to know the government's going to be a good partner. They do need to see that type of demand signal. And traditional sources of demand signal are always dominated. The formal contracting process is always dominated by the big five contractors. They're notorious for juking prices and providing bad products. I don't mind saying that out loud. I've worked with their stuff. I stand by my opinion. Um, it can be very hard for smaller, innovative companies to get into this space. And it's encouraging that there is enough focus from the top to write executive orders and create that demand signal, and actually put money behind it, create the task force. So if I'm, running a small innovative startup up here in the Syracuse area, and I know a couple of people who are, they're looking at this going, okay, that gives me 3 years of runway to get something into the hands of the warfighter and try to build a business around. Because once this administration's gone, everything they sign goes with them. And let's just say there's a lot of political stank around the current administration, as there always is, but there's some unique smells around this one. What do you think needs to happen? Assuming this approach continues to be successful, what needs to happen to standardize this, to make this last beyond the current administration, to give industry confidence that they can continue to approach the Department of War as a legitimate customer long term?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that this area, counter small UAS drones, are going to outlast both you and I, or especially me in uniform, right? So I don't think this is going away anywhere soon. And so really what it's about is setting the conditions to make JIDA 401 or something like it endure over time. And so those very tough bureaucratic conversations are something that I'm really involved with at this point. And so I think we're setting the conditions to make this an enduring capability. I'll call it that capability for the Department of War that will last well beyond my retirement if I'm not fired before then, right? And so the real question becomes, what do we do to incentivize and to encourage small businesses to invest in this space based upon the challenges that you rightly identified? I tell you that General Ross and our senior acquisition officer, we don't care who you are or where you come from. We care about the capability comprehensively defined that you can bring to bear. I can't tell you how many times on a daily basis that I get contacted by small emerging businesses that I then flip to our real acquisition experts to have a conversation. That is taking place, and that's heartening. The other thing that we recently did was have a very large-scale industry day with hundreds, if not thousands, of industry partners who came to learn about JIDA 401, learn about our governance of resources and where they can fit into this broader tapestry based upon what other capability they bring in terms of detect, identify, track, and then defeat. And so based upon the demand signal, which is really, really important from our senior leaders, we were putting in action a framework that would encourage these small businesses over time to be successful, at least in bending the ear of our leaders and then demonstrating their capability in a myriad of exercises that we put on.
Gotcha. If you had to identify the biggest bottleneck in getting effective counter drone technology into the operational force, what would it be? Is it actually having an effective counter drone technique? Is it producing it at that scale? Is it distribution? Is it training people on how to use it? Where is the biggest bottleneck between us and a force, 3 years from now that is fully trained and equipped to the extent possible to mitigate the threat of drones at the tactical and operational level?
Yeah, this answer, actually may surprise you and your listeners to a degree. So the first thing is, I think, a mindset shift that we're trying to encourage in JIDA 401 right now. And that's not just about differentiating between hardware and the more comprehensive understanding of what a capability is, it's about potentially going back to the future and reviving fundamental maneuver warfare concepts that are applicable to the counter drone space. And what do I mean by that? So you went to Ranger School. I'm a Ranger. Small unit tactics, things like protecting yourself, your foxhole, and improving your position through obfuscation, concealment, cover, dispersion, shifting of patterns. Those things are really, really important. They're passive. And again, they don't get much attention. And so what we're trying to do, JEDF, right now is sort of shift the mindset from exquisite capabilities that do cost, quite a bit of money, although we're trying to reduce that to something that we're much more familiar with in a maneuver sort of context. We're writing a book right now for JEDF 401 that will be a sort of foundational or capstone document that will guide the Joint Force, but also federal agencies and departments through this mindset shift. And so I think first and foremost, it's understanding that protection principles are enduring across time and space, and we got to treat them seriously. And by the way, don't take my word for it. I mean, there are other experts across the Army and the Joint Force. I'd point you to what the 10th Mountain Infantry Division had done in Iraq and Syria to protect itself after some crucial moments of learning. They now have an academy that they put on at Fort Drum, and you're well aware of that based upon your time up at Fort Drum. And so I think that would be one of the first things. Yeah. The other thing I would mention to you as well, besides protection, is in a homeland context. And so we have to differentiate counter drone in a homeland context to those force deployed sort of operations, is understanding the policies and authorities by which installation commanders and importantly operators, soldiers, sailors, right, can engage a drone. And so it wasn't as if there was no policy in the department for the last 10 or 15 years. Some of that policy was not aligned, and some of it was frankly confusing. And so another key measure of effectiveness for JEDF 401 has been to align that policy to clearly explain to installation commanders and operators when you can engage a target, when you can't, the measures you can take to ameliorate threat, all that kind of stuff. That's a pretty heavy lift. And so the training component here is really, really important in the homeland context as well. And then the final thing too, which I think is applicable to both homeland and force protection, is, as I said before, implied, I'll be explicit about it, there's no silver bullet for counter drone, is to understand that this is really a systems of systems sort of approach, which is to say layered defense. That you have to layer different capability, lethal, non-lethal, to extend your operational reach to gain space between you and an adversary's drone, and then bring to bear different capabilities, whether it's high-powered microwave, a laser, a machine gun, whatever it may be, based upon the bearing, altitude, range, and speed of a drone coming at your direction. And that layered defense, much like common C2 or an infrastructure that's interoperable with sensors and effectors, is also another piece of the magic, I think, for counter drones, just the same. And so protection, authorities, and policies, and then layered defense are those three things I think we have to educate the Joint Force on better.
Gotcha. Now we're coming up on time, but you're a member of a new and innovative task force. Y'all are either directly in charge of or a lot of influence over a ton of money that companies are going to be chasing, both for, patriotic reasons and profitable reasons. Hopefully those align for the small companies. What would you tell, a small innovative startup with an idea on what the best way to approach working with your task force would be?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so, of course, there's myriad of industry days and industry partner sort of engagements that JEDF 401 representatives will participate in over time. So, for instance, I was just in Tyson's Corner here in Washington, D.C. at one of these events representing JEDF 401 for General Ross, and took a lot of business cards and points of contact that I quickly transitioned to our acquisition division. So that's one key way I think you could do that. The other thing, too, is that if we don't have, we'll have a website. Of course, we're all over departmentofwar.gov. And so there are point of contacts that you can draw from there going forward to start the conversation. And then I'm always a resource, and you can find our team members on LinkedIn in various ways on social media. We will not turn down the opportunity to talk to industry's partners, as new or as small as they may be, just the same as big and old ones as well. And so I think it's more of the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. Try to get a hold of us through these various officials and unofficial ways, and then we'll do our due diligence to get back to you quickly as possible.
Awesome. Well, real quick before we sign off, is there anything that I haven't asked you about that I should ask you about?
I think we've had a pretty comprehensive conversation
Mhm.
today. A lot of the questions you asked, we could spend hours talking about. I think it's been pretty comprehensive.
Okay.
I will say that the last part that we talked about, the shift in mindset of protection authorities, policies, and layer defense and common C2, that stuff is really, really important. And it's all that back end work that JIDA 401 is doing right now that's going to enable us to be effective as a joint force in protecting ourselves against drones going forward. There is no loss of a sense of urgency
Yeah.
in our organization, nor among our senior officials. I mean, I was joking with our team today that this feels like we're deployed, and for good reason, right? Because soldiers are dying, we have a war, but this is going to continue to be a really, really important initiative for us going forward. And so I just offer to your listeners here that when we talk about a capability, a drone, a lesson from Ukraine, all the back end work that we're doing to make sure we get this right is really important.
Well said. Well, Paulie, thank you so much for spending time talking with us today. Appreciate the insights and the updates on what we're doing with drone warfare. Wish you guys nothing but the best and absolute success going forward, because the work you're doing literally saves American lives. So God bless you all.
Thanks, Scott.